There are two last variables that I was particularly curious about uh, with regard to training, and one is the type of muscle action and how that plays a role in hypertrophy.
Yeah, so there's actually three types of muscle actions. There's eccentric, there's concentric, and there's isometric. Now, in general dynamic training, meaning that you're moving the weights, not holding something, the isometric hold usually is not. It's not been well studied, first of all. So, like whether you were holding a weight, let's say at the top, if you squeeze the muscle, that would be the isometric hold portion. Really no good research that we have that's looked at that. So I kind of will discount that in the talk, in my discussion here. So
Even though
focus,
it is, even though it is possibly impactful, there just hasn't been much research on it. Okay.
correct. We just don't know.
Okay.
And I would say too that that would also impact other factors, such as the amount of reps you might be able to get at a certain, because we know that if you're not doing an isometric, you'll get a certain number of reps. Conceivably, if you're holding that isometric action and squeezing, that might have you do less reps in that given set. So you'd have to then see how you're going to equate the volume load. That would just cause. So when you're looking at the variables, often when you manipulate one variable, you then it causes an effect, an influence on another variable that has to be accounted for, and how that's accounted for will influence your conclusions that you can draw. So getting back to eccentric, concentric, both eccentric and concentric actions. So concentric is the when you're going against gravity, when you're lifting a weight against gravity, and eccentric is when you're lowering the weight, or you're going with gravity, and the muscle is lowering the weight, trying to resist the gravitational force. But there's good evidence that both concentric and eccentric actions both promote substantial hypertrophy. There's some evidence that eccentric actions might have slightly greater hypertrophic benefits. Particularly, one of the things that has to be pointed out is that you can lower a weight, or the lengthening portion can be much heavier. So you can actually create more mechanical tension, per se,
Right.
uh, if you're going to use super maximal loads, or even the same load. Let's say you can go to concentric failure, and then you can lower using forced repetitions, where you, when I say forced, we're using a spotter to help you up with the weight, and then lowering the load that you were training, which is called an accentuated eccentric action. How much difference it makes is not really clear. There's also some interesting research showing that eccentric training seems to have greater effects distally on the muscle, so at the lower portion of the muscle, whereas concentric training seems to be more effective at promoting hypertrophy in the mid portion of the muscle. There's a couple of studies that have shown that. So it could be that you just get greater regional, if by combining the actions, you're able to get greater whole muscle growth from a volume standpoint, the muscle volume standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So bottom line that I would say as far as that goes is you should do both. And I think there is some emerging evidence that it might be beneficial to do some accentuated eccentric actions if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy, that adding in some accentuated eccentrics. And there's various ways to go about it. You can, let's say, do 2 up, 1 down. So like a leg extension, you can lift up with both legs, and then on the lowering phase, lower with, let's say, your right leg on the first rep and your left leg on the second rep, and you repeat. Like I said, you can have a spotter, so you can have manual resistance where a spotter is there, lifts the weight up. After you finish, you got a failure, let's say, and you just lower the weight. You can just do a couple of sets of super maximal eccentrics. So various loading strategies that can be employed.
Sure. And then the last variable I was curious about was range of motion, particularly because I've always been interested in including partial reps in my workouts, but very rarely implemented them because I wasn't quite sure of their utility.
Yeah, so I was just involved in a meta-analysis, systematic review and meta-analysis carried out by a colleague of mine, Milo Wolf. I'll give him a shout out. This was part of his dissertation work. Really interesting topic. So it seems the compelling body of evidence certainly shows that doing full range of motion from a strength standpoint is going to get you strength gains throughout the entire range of motion. So if you're doing partials, your strength gains are going to be specific to the range that you're lifting it. And there's some roughly 15 degrees on either side of that range. You can experience some strength gains, but you won't get as good results strength-wise throughout the range of motion. However, hypertrophy, it's an interesting topic. Partial lengthened repetition. So using in your lengthen, let's say you're doing a biceps curl where you're starting here and just going up, let's say partially up, maybe even to parallel with the ground, so halfway up, shows greater hypertrophy than doing the shortened range. So the last part of the repetitions, let's say in a biceps curl from parallel to the finished portion of the movement. This has been shown in the biceps, the triceps, and the quadriceps, and the calves, and even the hamstrings to some extent, and utilizing a different model. So the lengthened position, there seems to be, and there's some rationales for it. It's called the length-tension relationship, that when muscles are stretched, there's greater passive forces that are involved in the muscles during those types of movement. And the hypertrophy seems to be certainly greater than doing it in the shortened position. And one of the studies I was involved in actually showed somewhat greater hypertrophy, at least at certain portions along the muscle, the quadriceps, compared to a full range. So it does lend itself to say that it might be beneficial, not necessarily to do all partials, but to utilize some lengthened partials in your limb movements. Now, I also do want to say that we do not have evidence. There's been no studies that have been carried out, let's say, in the pectorals, the latissimus dorsi, the rhomboids, the trapezius, so the muscles of the torso. And there's really no evidence. We've had no research in the gluteals. And a colleague of mine, Brett Contreras, who's one of the world's leading experts in
on the glutes.
On the glutes, correct. I mean, he has a theory, and I certainly think it's quite interesting that the glutes might have greater effects in the shortened position because of various factors associated with their anatomy. So these are things we just don't know. We can only extrapolate results to the research that we have. People like to overgeneralize, and they'll see one study that's done in the quads, and they think that we can just generalize it. All right, lengthened partials are the best way to train. It's just not the way research works.